So today it's not the ultrasound like yesterday. 9682 заседание Совета Безопасности объявляется открытым. Предварительной повесткой дня данного заседания гласит поддержание международного мира и безопасности. Повестка дня утверждается. На основании правила 37 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителей Польши. Уважаемые коллеги, в связи с тем, что Россия, заступая на пост председателя Совета Безопасности ООН, взяла на себя, как всегда, обязательство действовать транспарентно и беспристрастно, я бы хотел в открытом режиме разъяснить ситуацию вокруг участия в сегодняшнем заседании Украины. В секретариат вчера поступило письмо постоянного представителя этой страны с просьбой предоставить право. Мало того, что в отличие от всех остальных заявок, включая Польшу и Евросоюз, оно составлено с грубым нарушением сложившейся практики и не адресовано председателю Совета Безопасности, оно даже не содержит базовых протокольных формул, принятых дипломатических практик. Единственное предложение в нем — просьба допустить Украину на заседание. Непонятно, кому оно адресовано. А вот письма Польши и Евросоюза, где содержатся все необходимые элементы обращения к председателю Совета Безопасности. Мы проинформировали членов Совета о поступившем от Украины запросе. Хочу подчеркнуть, мы не видим никаких проблем с тем, чтобы допустить ее к участию в заседании как страну, интересы которой затрагивают вопрос. Это соответствует правилам процедуры. Мы сразу транслировали сигнал, как только председательство получит корректно оформленный запрос, участие Украины в заседании, form with the agreement of the members of the Security Council will be accepted. However, the Ukrainian delegation did not send in the proper request. It's clear that they need to show that they stand above the rules of the Security Council, and like other delegations who request under Rule 37, including the European states, they have the right to dictate their own conditions. We, as the presidency, cannot accept that. The rules are the same for everyone, and that is to ensure the functioning of the Security Council throughout the month. The attempt by the Ukrainian delegation is an attempt to undermine the authority of the Security Council, because the presidency is not just a country, but it's an institution, and I hope all colleagues accept that. Nevertheless, in the absence of objections, we agree to let Ukraine take part in today's meeting, but only on condition that it was requested by the United States. We intend to satisfy the request of the United States in accordance with the rules. We regret that Ukraine cannot act independently, even on such a procedural matter as a meeting of the Security Council. And even in that, it has to be led by its sponsor. Я прошу секретариат пригласить Украину для участия в этом заседании.
I would ask the Secretary to invite Ukraine to take part in the meeting.
На основании правила 39 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании следующих докладчиков. Исполняющие обязанности заместителя генерального секретаря по гуманитарным вопросам и обязанности координатора чрезвычайной помощи госпожу Джойс Сую и кардиохирурга, анестезиолога и активиста господина Владимира Жову. Решение принимается. На основании правила 39 временных правил процедуры Совета я также приглашаю принять участие в заседании главу делегации Европейского союза по организации Объединенных Наций, его превосходительство господина Ставроса Ломбринидиса. Решение принимается. Совет Безопасности приступает к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки. Сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Джойс Суи.
Since I briefed the Council last month, there has been no respite for civilians in Ukraine amid continuing waves of attacks across the entire country. Okhmatdyt were severely damaged. Its toxicology department, where children receive dialysis, was completely destroyed. First responders attending the scene immediately after the attack found children receiving treatment for cancer in hospital beds, set up in parks and on the street, where medical workers had quickly established triage areas among the chaos, dust, and debris. Reportedly, 27 civilians, including 4 children, were killed, and 117, including 7 children, were injured. The Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights, OHCHR, are verifying figures while rescue workers, hospital staff, and volunteers continue to clear rubble in search for people trapped under debris. Health officials reported that what remains of the children's hospital is without electricity, preventing the use of ventilators and other urgent care. Our health partners have therefore helped to move child patients to other facilities and have been providing psychosocial support and assisting with other urgent needs. UN human rights staff also witnessed a massive outpouring of solidarity from local residents who rushed to the scene to help remove rubble and provide blankets, water, and food for patients and medical staff. I also regret that in Kyiv, at least 7 civilians were killed at the Isida Medical Center, one of Ukraine's largest women's health and family planning centers, when debris from an intercepted missile hit the facility. Mr. President, I echo the Secretary General's, UN Human Rights High Commissioners, and others' strong condemnations of these deplorable attacks. My heart goes out to all those affected. Let me remind this Council that hospitals have special protection under international humanitarian law. Intentionally directing attacks against a protected hospital is a war crime, and perpetrators must be held to account. Mr. President, these incidents are part of a deeply concerning pattern of systemic attacks harming healthcare and other civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. Attacks have intensified since the spring of 2024. As of 30 June 2024, OHCHR has verified conflict-related violence in Ukraine has claimed the lives of 11,284 civilians and left 22,594 others injured, a total of 33,878 civilian casualties since February 2022. This does not include figures from yesterday's attacks. The World Health Organization has now verified 1,878 attacks affecting healthcare facilities, personnel, transport, supplies, and patients since February 2022. Attacks have also significantly impacted homes, education facilities, office buildings, and public transport. And they have disrupted electricity, gas, water supplies for millions of households. Energy production capacity across the country is significantly reduced. The consequences for the humanitarian situation in Ukraine are, of course, severe. More than 14.6 million people, about 40% of Ukraine's population, require some form of humanitarian assistance. 56% of these people are women and girls. Access to medical care for women and girls, including maternal and reproductive health care, is severely restricted. Thousands of children continue to have daily lessons in bunkers 20 feet below the ground. And for everyone, the constant fear caused by this war is having a serious impact on mental health. More than 10 million people urgently need support to cope with the stress, anxiety, and other mental health challenges associated with the conflict. Mr. President, in this context, it is deeply troubling that aid operations are also being impacted by these attacks. Just last week, a strike destroyed an apartment block immediately in front of the United Nations office in Dnipro City, Ukraine's fourth largest city, home to thousands of people fleeing hostilities and a base for a significant number of aid organizations. The attack killed and injured civilians, including aid workers, and destroyed homes. A second attack in Dnipro on the same day also damaged hospitals, schools, and a collective site hosting more than 120 displaced people. It bears repeating, throughout all military operations, constant care must be taken to spare civilians and civilian objects from harm. Mr. President, as we have mentioned in previous Council briefings, humanitarian operations in some areas also lack access to people in need. We remain deeply concerned about the 1.5 million people who are unable to reach in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia regions occupied by the Russian Federation. Like all others living close to the front line in Ukraine, they undoubtedly require urgent access to healthcare and medicine, food, and clean drinking water. In accordance with international humanitarian law, it is imperative that impartial humanitarian relief can be facilitated for all civilians in need. Mr. President, despite the challenges in the first 4 months of 2024, the UN and its partners, many of them local organizations, still managed to provide life-saving assistance to 4.4 million people across Ukraine. We are grateful to the donors who have so far provided the $887 million in funding that has allowed us to do so. But the reality is that 6 months into the year, this only amounts to 28% of the $3.1 billion required. To sustain operations in an increasingly complex and dangerous environment, we urgently need donors to accelerate funding for the humanitarian response. All the more so as another winter approaches amid no sign of an easing of hostilities or their impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure. To facilitate early procurement and pre-positioning of winter supplies, the UN and its humanitarian partners are launching the Winter Preparedness Plan for 2024-2025, supported by an allocation of $55 million from the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. But alone, this will not be enough to get Ukrainians through another winter of war. More is urgently needed. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, for more than 2 years now, people across all of Ukraine have shown remarkable fortitude and resilience in unbelievably challenging circumstances. However, yesterday's attacks and their impacts are a reminder of the deplorable human toll of this war, particularly on the most vulnerable members of the society, tragedies we will see again and again as long as this conflict continues and the rules of war are defied. I therefore once again call on this Council and all Member States to support all efforts to ensure respect for international law and bring an end to the suffering and destruction. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Volodymyr Zhovnir.
Dear members of Security Council, thank you for opportunity to speak today. I am Vladimir Zhovnir, a doctor and director of Okhmatdyt since January 2021. Okhmatdyt means mother and child care, and it is largest Ukrainian medical center. The hospital treats children with cancer, with blood disease from all of our country. Each year, around 80,000 children receive treatment, around 20,000 receive emergency care, and we perform about 13,000 surgeries. The hospital also offers treatment patients from other countries. Yesterday, at 9:52 a.m., an air raid siren sounded. The hospital staff began evacuate patients to the bomb shelters. This is challenging with children in intensive care. For our past 2.5 years, the Russian war against Ukraine, our staff have done everything that possible during each attack to save lives and minimize deaths. At that time yesterday, more than 600 patients and around same number of hospital workers were in hospital. Children were on drips, on dialysis, on intensive care. On top of that, at time attack, the 3 heart surgeries were in progress. In operation room, pausing them would be dangerous for life. At 10:42 a.m., we felt a powerful explosion. The ground shook and the wall trembled. Both children and adults screamed and cried from fear, and the wounded from pain. It was a real hell. We went into a yard and we saw that a Russian missile had struck the intensive care and therapy department for chronic intoxication. The part of building was completely destroyed. The floor collapsed, and we could hear people crying out from help from beneath the rubble. As a result of attack, over the 300 people were injured, including 8 children. 2 adults died. One from them was our young doctor. The primary goal of evacuate patients who rely the life support system. We evacuate more than 600 patients, more than 100 transferred to other hospital. Evacuation continue. Our medical staff have also been taken in to the hospital to provide medical care to these children. Hospital toxicology building and traumatology department have been completely destroyed. A part of country's only oncology laboratory was destroyed. In total, 24 departments are damaged, including 10 surgical departments, 5 oncology departments, 3 intensive care units, 2 operation blocks, 2 somatic departments, the radiology department, prenatal care department, and the radiation therapy department. We had suspend medical service, the Department of Toxicology and Emergency Care. Operations and trauma unit are halted. We continue evacuating and full damage caused by direct Russian attack on the Children's Hospital. The strike will have long-lasting effect. Patients will face shortage of medical care, and our specialization service with high-tech equipment won't be restored soon. We will have serious long-term impact on Ukrainian children needing medical care. The psychological trauma of children from this attack will severe. It will last a long time, a cold effect for them for all their whole life. To conclude, striking of Children's Hospital, we were children and treated for cancer and other heavy disease is not just a war criminal. It's far beyond the limit of humanity. Our doctors and our employees have been saving children's life to the last, even under missiles and fire. We will not surrender. Thank you, all of you, for your attention.
I thank Mr. Volodymyr Zhovner for his briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements, and I give the floor to France. Mr. President, I thank Ms. Suya and Mr. Zhovner for their statements. On Monday, July 8th, Russia carried out massive strikes against a number of civilian targets in Ukraine. These missiles hit the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, where children are treated for grave diseases, including cancer. Another strike several hours later hit a medical center in Kyiv. According to preliminary estimates, these attacks have killed at least 37 people. Once again, Russia has deliberately targeted residential neighborhoods and healthcare infrastructure. France condemns these flagrant violations of international law, which are yet another entry in a list of war crimes for which Russia will be held accountable. As it has been doing for nearly 2 years with massive strikes on the country's energy infrastructure, Russia is targeting civilian targets and seeks to undermine the resilience of the Ukrainian people. France reiterates its support for the work carried out by the United Nations and other organizations to document these violations and ensure accountability. These acts are in addition to the forced transfer of Ukrainian children. All of these grave violations committed against children have this year once again justified Russia's inscription on the infamous list of the annual report on children in armed conflict. These facts confirm once again that our support for Ukraine must continue and increase. As the European Council recalled on June 27th, Russia cannot and and will not win this war. France will therefore continue providing Ukraine with the necessary support for its legitimate defense for as long as it takes. It will continue its humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. France mobilized 300 million euros in 2022 and 2023, and in 2024, France will provide more than 100 million euros to support the healthcare, education, demining, energy, and water sectors. We once again call on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory, as demanded by the International Court of Justice on March 16, 2022. We will remain mobilized to ensure respect for the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and will continue to tirelessly condemn their violation. I thank you. I thank France for their statement, and I now give the floor to Ecuador.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Madam Joyce Msuya, Deputy Secretary General, Acting Secretary General, for her briefing. I also listened to Mr. Zhovnir's statement attentively. I acknowledge the presence in this chamber of the representatives of Ukraine, Poland, and the European Union. Ecuador notes with deep concern the recent intensification of hostilities in Ukraine that has caused numerous deaths and wounded persons, affecting residential buildings and commercial buildings in different cities. What is particularly intolerable is the destruction of the children's hospital Okhmatdyt in Kyiv, which, as we have listened, has left a toll of innocent civilian victims, including children and women. Healthcare facilities such as hospitals and other infrastructures created for the purpose of medical care should be respected and protected in all circumstances and by all parties to the conflict. We hope that this event is duly investigated so that it does not remain unpunished. The devastating images that detail the suffering caused by these attacks, as well as those of just a few weeks ago that show the panic among civilians that were peacefully enjoying the beach in occupied Crimea, are evidence of the human tragedy unfolding before our eyes as a result of this conflict. Ecuador reiterates its appeal to all parties to respect international humanitarian law, in particularly observing the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, because it is essential to spare the lives of civilians and protect civilian infrastructures. I would like to recall that the Secretary General, echoing what he considers a generalized appeal of the international community, has systematically pleaded with the parties to refrain from using explosive weapons in populated areas because their use could cause direct, indiscriminate, and long-term damage. For this reason, combat should take place far away from urban areas. Mr. President, this conflict is a tragedy for the peoples of Russia and Ukraine, and therefore it must end. It is discouraging that, in spite of the efforts and initiatives to seek peace, the hostilities are intensifying, and it's civilians who are continuing to pay the highest price. We must move from a logic of domination and force to a logic of diplomacy and a peaceful solution of conflicts. Ecuador firmly believes in a peaceful solution of the conflict through negotiation and diplomacy, based on respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and based on international law and the UN Charter. I would echo the appeal to the Russian Federation to withdraw its troops from occupied territory, as well as the clamor of the international community for this war not to last even another day. Thank you very much.
I thank Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to Switzerland. Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs ad interim Joyce Msuya, as well as Dr. Zhovnir for their statements. I also welcome the participation of colleagues from Ukraine, the EU, and Poland. Mr. President, we are shocked that a children's hospital, where many suffer from serious illnesses and are in extremely vulnerable conditions, has been hit by a Russian strike. And we heard already that missile strikes across Ukraine have caused death and injuries by hitting civilian infrastructure in Kyiv, Dnipro, Kryvyi Rih, Pokrovsk, Slovyansk, and Kramatorsk. These strikes reportedly killed dozens of civilians and hit Kyiv's largest children's hospital, as well as another medical facility in the capital. And I express our deepest condolences to all the families of the victims and those injured and everyone else affected by these strikes. Children have once again become victims of Russia's military aggression, which has been ongoing for 2 years and 5 months. We strongly condemn these attacks. The civilian population and civilian infrastructure must not be targeted. International law, and particular human rights and humanitarian law, must be strictly respected by all parties in all circumstances, and we call on Russia to comply and protect the civilian population and infrastructure. Under international humanitarian law, hospitals enjoy special protection. The horror that children and their families have had to face since the start of the war in Ukraine shows no sign of abating. In 2023, the United Nations attributed 249 attacks on schools and hospitals, including against protected persons, to Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. In the last 2 years, nearly 2,000 children are thought to have been killed or injured. Instead of going to school, children in towns on Ukraine's front lines have been forced to spend between 3,000 and 5,000 hours sheltering in basements and subway stations, that is between 4 and 7 months. As Ukraine fights for its peaceful future, those who will build it, including children, must be guaranteed protection. International humanitarian law provides special protection for children. In addition, a health worker has also been killed in yesterday's strike. Here, too, international humanitarian law is absolutely clear. Protecting humanitarian personnel, including medical staff, is an obligation. Those who risk their lives to help others must be protected. Mr. President, no child should grow up under the threat of missile fire. No child should die in the rubble of a hospital, which is supposed to be a safe place for healing and recovery. Every child should have the opportunity to lead a safe and serene life and return to a normal existence. For this to be possible, Russia must end its military aggression against Ukraine, cease all hostilities, and withdraw its troops from all Ukrainian territory. The Charter commits us all to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Switzerland remains determined to do everything in its power to contribute to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in accordance with that same United Nations Charter and the fundamental principles of international law. It is in this spirit that on June 15th and 16th, representatives of over 100 countries from around the world and international organizations met in Switzerland to discuss a framework for a possible peace process based on international law and, in particular, the UN Charter, with the aim of inspiring concrete measures in favor of a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And we will continue delivering on that commitment. I thank you. I thank Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank both briefers, Ms. Misiuna and Dr. Zhovnir, for their contribution, and I welcome participation of the Ukraine, European Union and Poland. Mr. President, we are appalled by the latest airstrikes on Ukraine by the country that you are representing. While we fail to understand the reason for this war, we are convinced that there is absolutely nothing that can justify the brutal attacks on critical civilian infrastructure. Nothing justifies systemic attacks on medical facilities. Yesterday, another low in this war of aggression was reached, with a direct missile strike at the Okhmatdyt hospital, one of Europe's largest children's hospitals. As if this were not enough, the follow-up strike wrecked a maternity hospital in the vicinity. We are again seeing the full spectrum of horror this war has brought, this time around with children and their parents at its center. It is indeed beyond the limits of humanity, as Dr. Zhovnir just described his feelings. In response to Russia's claims that the responsibility for this devastation should be put on air defense systems, we would like to clarify. Independent sources are disproving these claims. We deplore Russian missile strikes, and we reject the lack of responsibility that Russia is showing in relation to them. Mr. President, the Council should not lose sight of the full picture of the destruction this war has brought. Yesterday's horrid missile attack is just the tip of the iceberg. WHO has verified that from April to May this year, more than one-third of attacks against healthcare facilities happened in Ukraine. In parallel, the healthcare needs have been increasing. In 2024, the civilian casualties have been continuously on the rise, with each month demanding a greater death toll. Additionally, only in May, the new offensive around the city of Kyiv caused the largest displacement in Ukraine since 2023. Mr. President, killing and maiming children and attacks against hospitals are grave violations against children in armed conflicts. Deliberate targeting of critical civilian infrastructure is prohibited by the international humanitarian law. Rejecting responsibility equals endorsing impunity. This Council is entrusted by the Charter to address and prevent all of the above. Too many fathers and mothers have been killed, too many children have been deprived of the future, too many homes and schools have been reduced to rubble, and too many hospitals have stopped providing life-saving services. We have seen enough death and destruction for a lifetime. No amount of our support, physical or psychological rehabilitation, or assistance to the health and emergency services can alleviate all this suffering. So, Mr. President, please stop this war. It has been going on for too long.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for a statement, and I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Acting USG Joyce Msuya and Mr. Zhovnir for their timely and informative briefings. We have gathered in this chamber to discuss the war in Ukraine on many previous occasions, but today's session feels different. Where to begin after seeing the unimaginably horrific scenes of children and infants being attacked in the hospital beds? How did we get here? While we are well aware that civilian casualties are a tragic but inevitable consequence of war, we would still like to believe that there are certain lines people will not cross. From the outset, the Russian Federation has tried to justify its invasion into Ukraine's sovereign territory as a defensive action, but few believe this. Its repeated, deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure throughout the conflict are indefensible. This latest offensive by Russia against the civilian targets across Ukraine was especially brazen, causing scores of casualties and serious damage to civilian infrastructure, most notably the missile strike against the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv, where my President Yoon Suk-yeol and the First Lady visited in July 2023 to comfort the children and their families receiving treatment. This is a new law. An attack against the most vulnerable among us betrays a basic lack of humanity. Russia's ongoing indiscriminate attacks against civilian objects across Ukraine is a flagrant violation of international law, including international humanitarian law, and those responsible for such heinous acts must be held accountable. At the same time, our hearts go out to all the victims. Colleagues, we once again reiterate that Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine and its annexation of Ukrainian territories through the use of force are serious violations of the UN Charter and international law. and run counter to the core values underpinning the international system. In this respect, I'd like to remind you all that only a handful of countries, such as North Korea, have recognized the unlawful annexation of Ukrainian land by Russia. The overwhelming majority of UN member states still strongly believe that those regions are an integral part of sovereign Ukraine state. The longer this war continues, the greater number of lives will suffer miserably and the greater likelihood for further regional instability. Therefore, the only way forward is to work diligently towards an early end to the war. In this regard, my delegation once again stresses that all the devastating events and the human suffering transpiring in Ukraine are a result of Russia's illegal invasion. This must end now without preconditions. The Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and provide vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction until they achieve just and lasting peace in their land. I thank you.
I thank the Republic of Korea for your statement, and I now give the floor to China.
President, I thank Acting USG Ms. Suya for her briefing, and I listened carefully to the statement of Mr. Zovnir. Since the full escalation of the crisis in Ukraine in February 2022, the ongoing conflict has led to a large number of casualties among innocent civilians and the damage and destruction of many infrastructures, triggering a serious humanitarian crisis with huge spillover effects, which is a source of deep concern for China. Recently, instead of stopping, the fighting has intensified, and vicious attacks occurred from time to time, which resulted in serious casualties. China is deeply concerned about it. We reiterate our call on the parties to the conflict to exercise rationality and restraint, effectively comply with international humanitarian law, and do their utmost to avoid civilian casualties and attacks on civilian objects. There are no winners in conflict and confrontation, and military means will not bring lasting peace. President Xi Jinping, during his recent meeting with a foreign leader, stressed that an early ceasefire and a political settlement are in the interests of all parties, adding that the priority is to de-escalate the situation by observing the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fanning by any party over the flames. He called on the international community to create conditions and provide support for the resumption of direct dialogue and negotiations between the two parties, stating that only if all major countries inject positive rather than negative energy can a ceasefire in this conflict emerge as soon as possible. On the Ukraine issue, China has always maintained that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be adhered to. The legitimate security concerns of all states should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. We call on the parties to the conflict to show political will, meet each other halfway, and start peace talks at an early date. We call on the international community, based on an objective and impartial position, to create conditions conducive to putting an early end to the fighting and play an active role in this regard. We call upon all parties concerned to work together, uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable concept of security, and promote the establishment of a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. China will continue to actively promote peace talks in its own way and make unremitting efforts and play a constructive role in promoting a political settlement of the Ukraine issue. I thank you, President.
I thank China for their statement, and I give the floor to Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Acting USG Ms. Joyce Musea for our briefing. And I take note of the sobering information provided by Mr. Vladimir Zovny. I welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Poland, and the head of the delegation of the European Union. Sierra Leone notes with deep concern the recent reported missile strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. It is reported that during a daytime attack, missiles struck multiple Ukrainian cities, killing at least 31 people, injuring about 125 others, and seriously damaging a major children's hospital. Based on the report, those killed in the multiple missile strikes include doctors, patients, women and children, the very best of society, and also most vulnerable in times of armed conflict. Sierra Leone expresses deepest condolences to the victims and the families of the victims affected by the missile strikes. Sierra Leone deplores attacks on civilians, civilian and protected objects, and vital infrastructure. The report of the missile strike of the Kyiv main children's hospital, resulting in the loss of innocent lives and the extensive damage to a critical healthcare facility, are truly heartbreaking and distressing. We call on all the parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international law and take immediate steps at de-escalation. We have previously reiterated in this Council that the deliberate targeting of residential or civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and essential services, such as hospitals, schools, water, and energy facilities, are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. It poses a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law. The devastating impact of these strikes on civilians, including women and children, is a stark reminder of the urgent need for the violence to end and a renewed commitment to protecting civilian lives and infrastructure in conflict zones. It also begs for independent investigations aimed at accountability. We call on all involved parties to exercise restraint and take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. The protection of civilians must be paramount in any conflict, including the conflict in Ukraine. Ensuring that the parties to the conflict maintain the safety of civilians must be the utmost collective priority of this Security Council. Let me therefore close, Mr. President, by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including hospitals, to ensure essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. The involved parties must choose and prioritize peace. Peace is made not between friends, but between parties in a state of disagreement. Peace can also not be left to chance. Sierra Leone therefore reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting resolution of the conflict. In taking this important step, we call for the full respect for the Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account. I thank you.
I thank Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to Algeria. Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator ad interim, Ms. Joyce Msuya, for her briefing. We also listened with interest to the statement by Mr. Jovnir. Algeria once again expresses its deep concern over the ongoing escalation of tension caused by military operations in Russia and Ukraine. Unfortunately, it is Ukrainians who bear the brunt of this incessant escalation. In addition, the dire humanitarian situation is also a source of deep concern and requires a clear commitment from both sides to put an end to it. As we meet again to discuss this alarming situation on the ground, we still see no signs of a de-escalation. In this context, allow me to share the following comments. First of all, it is essential to give due priority to diplomatic efforts to address the very serious humanitarian crisis in Ukraine in a comprehensive manner. This can only be achieved through a clear commitment by all parties to de-escalation and respect for the UN Charter and international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Secondly, the logic of confrontation has never yielded a solution to disputes. Instead, its place must be taken by restraint, dialogue, and negotiations based on the principles of inclusiveness and a peaceful settlement of disputes. The use of weapons will only lead to more lives lost, including amongst civilians and especially children. This will bring more suffering to the population, it will bring the destruction of infrastructure, and will raise the risks of pushing back a solution to the conflict. Algeria reiterates its commitment to support all efforts aimed at achieving peace and at laying the foundation for a sustainable and peaceful solution to this crisis. Thirdly, the polarization resulting from this crisis is a source of grave concern for Algeria. Indeed, it contributes to further escalation with disastrous consequences for international peace and security, including food security and energy security. Algeria is convinced that multilateral efforts and intensified international diplomatic efforts are the best way to achieve concrete solutions to this crisis. Such efforts will allow to preserve diplomatic frameworks and reach a peaceful settlement in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the legitimate security concerns of all parties. I thank you. I thank Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to Malta.
President, I would like to thank Acting USG Masuya and Mr. Jovnir for their briefings. As has been the case for previous sessions, large-scale Russian aerial attacks continue across Ukraine, with a sustained targeting of essential infrastructures causing more death, destruction, and trauma. Yesterday, the Russian Federation launched another wave of deathly strikes across several regions in Ukraine. At least 40 long-range missiles were fired at targets across the country, killing dozens and wounding over 150. The Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, Ukraine's largest children's hospital, and the main treatment center for the children in the country for children with cancer, was also hit during these attacks. 12 departments were damaged, and a section of Ukraine's only oncology and hematology laboratories were completely destroyed. Power, oxygen, and water supplies have been lost, and people were trapped under the rubble. The exact number of victims is still unknown. The Isida Maternity Hospital, located in Ukraine's capital, was also severely damaged due to the falling debris. The hospital counts with 27 sources of ionizing radiation and is a beneficiary of the IAEA's Technical Cooperation Program. This missile attack not only endangers lives, but also constitutes a violation of the IAEA's core principles and values. We express our condolences to the families who are enduring the unbearable loss of their loved ones and wish a speedy recovery to those injured due to these ruthless attacks across Ukraine. Health and educational facilities must always be protected to ensure uninterrupted delivery of health and education services to all people in Ukraine. Attacks on civilians and civilian objects must stop. That should be at the center of our efforts. International humanitarian and human rights law must be respected at all times. Malta condemns in the strongest possible terms these attacks. We reiterate our call to immediately cease all attacks against hospitals, residential buildings, and critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and for all parties to adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Yesterday's events took place against the background of Russia's launch of its new military offensive in the Kyiv region. According to the WHO, there are reports of 18 deaths and 81 injuries from more than 175 attacks on healthcare infrastructure in Ukraine for the first half of 2024. These attacks have similarly endangered the lives of thousands of children, healthcare workers, and civilians, including the already vulnerable population, not least the elderly, children, and people with disabilities. Malta reiterates that the perpetrators of these actions must be held accountable for the damage done. We express our full support to the mandate of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as to the register of damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and the work on the establishment of a future compensation mechanism. In closing, Malta reiterates that the only path to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace and an end to the suffering being inflicted on innocent Ukrainians is for Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to Mozambique.
Mr. President, we extend our gratitude to Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Acting Emergency Relief Coordinator, Joyce Msua, for our information. We took note to the briefing by Mr. Volodymyr. We recognize the presence of the representatives of Ukraine, Poland, and the delegations of the European Union in this meeting. Mr. President, in light of the report attacks resulting in civilian casualties, injuries, and destructions of critical civilian sites and infrastructures in Ukraine, my delegation wishes to emphasize the following points. First, civilian deaths, both intentional and incidental, and instances where conflicting parties put civilians in harm's way by positioning them near military targets, must not be condemned. We urge the warring parties to exercise maximum restraint and avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, the leading causes of civilian casualties in Ukraine. Our position on the humanitarian dimension of this and the other conflicts remain consistent, unchanged, and worth reiterating. 1. The respect for international humanitarian law and international humanitarian rights law, which have protection of civilians as it is cornerstone, must be upheld under any circumstances. B. The principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be rigorously adhered to and upheld and by all parties. Warring parties must assess whether civilian harm is likely to be excessive compared to the concrete military advantage anticipated. All parties must facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian personnel and relief to civilians in need. Mr. President, ultimately, ending this conflict is the most crucial step to address its man-made humanitarian consequences. To achieve this, we urge the parties to immediately cess hostilities, resume direct negotiations without preconditions, and engage in a dialogue in good faith. Mr. President, let I seize the opportunity to recommit to the UN as the EDO platform to start genuine dialogue towards a negotiated settlement aimed at bringing this conflict to a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace that addresses its root causes and upholds the Charter. I thank you, President.
I thank Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Acting USG Joyce Msuya and Dr. Volodymyr Jovenir for their briefings. We welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Poland, and the European Union in today's meeting. We also extend our condolences to the government and people of Ukraine, including the families and loved ones of those who were killed yesterday, and wish for the speedy and full recovery of those injured. Mr. President, Guyana is extremely alarmed by the continued attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure since the start of this war. The attacks have claimed the lives of more than 11,000 civilians, including women and children, and continue to destroy objects indispensable to their survival. We have repeatedly warned of the devastating consequences of prolonging this war, especially in light of the attacks against hospitals, electricity transmission systems, food ports, gas and water supplies, and a high number of civilian casualties. Mr. President, yesterday's missile strikes were particularly shocking. It was reportedly the largest assault in months, killing over 30 people, including children, and causing extensive damage to the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv. The airstrike against the hospital turned a large part of what was once a place of sanctuary and healing for so many children into rubble, destroying its toxicology and oncology wards and many other units. We condemn these attacks in the strongest possible terms, stressing that the most vulnerable of civilians, children, were among the hapless victims. What military or other advantage is there to gain from the unconscionable attack against a children's hospital? Mr. President, the devastating accounts of unrelenting violence, death, and destruction must compel us to take urgent action to end this war. Lives, including those of innocent children, cannot continue to be sacrificed at the altar of political brinksmanship. We commend the efforts of those seeking to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict and urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We also urge them to engage in good faith and to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children who have already paid too high a price in this war. Guyana demands that the parties to the conflict take all necessary measures to protect civilians and critical infrastructure and to comply fully with their obligations under international law, including the United Nations Charter and international humanitarian and human rights law. We stress the need for accountability for the ongoing violations as a critical element on the path to peace. We further call on the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We echo the acting USG's grave concern, and indeed that of the wider international community, about the increasingly dire humanitarian situation in the country. It is difficult to comprehend the continued denial of access to people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. We call upon the Russian Federation to grant humanitarian access to all populations in need in the occupied territories. We commend the ongoing response of humanitarian agencies and call on the international community to further support their efforts, including by contributing to the Humanitarian Needs and Response Fund. In closing, Mr. President, I would like to stress the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. Guyana will continue to support all efforts of the United Nations Secretary General and other partners who have been working diligently to achieve a peaceful and sustainable end to this war. I thank you.
I thank Guyana for their statement, and I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, for your informative briefing. I also thank Director General Jobner for your briefing and for your courage and for continuing to show up for your patients, even in the direst circumstances. I welcome the participation of Poland, the EU, and particularly Ukraine to this meeting. Colleagues, I'll cut to the chase. We're here today because Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, the current rotational president of the Security Council, attacked a children's hospital. Even uttering that phrase sends a chill down my spine. Russia attacked a children's hospital in broad daylight, killing and injuring children. Chilling. Colleagues, on Monday morning, Russian missiles smashed into civilian targets, including Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, the largest pediatric facility in Ukraine, and a lifeline for the country's most vulnerable. In the hours since, we've seen images of children bloodied and injured, escaping the damage, of cancer patients just a few years old hooked up to IV drips huddled outside the hospital's bombed out cancer wing. We've heard the courageous stories of doctors and nurses scrambling to evacuate sick children, many of whom are intubated and on ventilators to safety. Of members of the community heroically sifting through the rubble in hopes of finding survivors, of not adding another number to the rising death toll. Director General Jobner has just enhanced our understanding of the impact of this on the 600 patients plus staff in the hospital, including those who were in surgery. Our hearts are with all of those who've lost loved ones, who wonder how their children can get the medicine and the care that they need, who wake up this morning worried about their home, their business, their family will be the next one destroyed by a Russian strike. Because let's be clear, this brutal attack is hardly a standalone incident. In March 2022, Russian airstrikes damaged a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol. In December 2023, a Russian missile plunged into a medical facility in Dnipro. And I could go on, but the fact is that across the country, hundreds of children have been killed, thousands have been wounded, and millions have been displaced from their homes as Russia continues its campaign of terror in Ukraine. And then there are those children Russia has deported or forcibly transferred, robbing Ukrainian youth of not only their futures, but their very identities. Colleagues, when Putin announced his so-called peace plan last month, I called it what it was, an outrageous attempt to force Ukraine to accept an unjust peace while facing the barrel of a gun. As if there was any doubt that this was the case, yesterday's attack makes abundantly clear Putin is not interested in peace. He's committed to wreaking death and destruction in pursuit of his war of aggression. And of course, Putin hasn't just attacked hospitals. Russia has upped its coordinated attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, taking out over half of the country's power generation. Power plants in Kyiv are operating at severely reduced capacity due to nearly daily attacks. Tens of thousands have had to evacuate. This is a deliberate and cruel effort to leave millions of Ukrainians without heat this winter. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Russia started this war, and Russia can end it at any time. As my colleague from France stated, Russia cannot win this war. It could choose to withdraw its forces from Ukraine and end the assault on hospitals and power plants. It could halt its campaign of torture and deportation, its pattern of violating international law. It could heed the will of over 140 countries who have repeatedly called for this madness to stop. Until that day, and until the victims of these atrocities have gotten the accountability and justice they deserve, the United States will stand with Ukraine. We will stand with Ukraine in its efforts to defend its borders, and we will stand with Ukraine here in this Council. As laid out in last month's Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland, we will support Ukraine's right to self-defense and invest in the country's recovery, reconstruction, reform, and modernization. And we will uphold the principles of the UN Charter, including respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. We encourage every member of this Council and every corner of the international community to do exactly the same. Thank you.
I thank the United States for their statement, and I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
I would like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General Masuya and Dr. Zhovnir for their briefings, and I welcome the participation of Ukraine, Poland, and the EU in our meeting today. I offer the UK government's deepest condolences to Dr. Zhovnir and the victims of Russia's latest appalling airstrikes across Ukraine, and to their families and their loved ones. Since the 23rd of February 2022, in repeated attacks on Ukraine, Russia has killed Ukrainian children. Russia has maimed and injured Ukrainian children. Russia has abducted Ukrainian children. And yesterday, Russia came back for wounded and sick children in Okhmatdyt hospital. This is cowardly depravity, and this must stop. I visited Okhmatdyt hospital last December. It's become a refuge for children injured in attacks across Ukraine. I saw for myself the dedication of Dr. Zhovnir and his staff and the care they provide. I met two young girls among many who were resolutely learning to walk again with prosthetics. One had been injured in Russia's attack on Kyiv. The other in Russia's attack against Kramatorsk railway station. Colleagues, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects constitutes war crimes. The ICC has already issued arrest warrants for the Russian president, former defense minister, the chief of the general staff, and the Commissioner for Children's Rights for suspected war crimes. Since the 23rd of February 2022, Russia has violated the UN Charter and repeatedly breached international humanitarian law. Its conduct is a disgrace to the Security Council and especially to the President's seat. Colleagues, we must join together to condemn Russia's actions and stand foursquare behind the UN Charter and its guarantees of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and behind international law and international humanitarian law. For our part, the UK, together with our partners, will continue to ensure Ukraine is able to defend itself from these barbaric acts of violence, as confirmed by my Defence Secretary this weekend in Odessa, where he announced new military aid for Ukraine's defence. At the NATO summit this week, we will demonstrate our resolve to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will also work to ensure accountability and justice for the Ukrainian people. And we will support Ukraine to secure a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. I want to commend the exceptional resilience of the Ukrainian people, and in particular to pay tribute to the Ukrainian emergency services, especially over the last 48 hours. I also express my admiration for the doctors and other hospital workers at Okhmatdyt and for their patients. In conclusion, I call on Russia again to end its aggression against Ukraine and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and stop killing Ukrainian children. Thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Musuya and Mr. Zovna for their detailed briefings. Today, we have come together once again to confront the grim reality caused by the escalating attacks by Russia across Ukraine. According to the reports, a barrage of Russian missiles across Ukraine caused serious damage and many casualties, including at a pediatric hospital in Kyiv, where many young, innocent children are hospitalized. Japan condemns Russia's attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine in the strongest terms. We express our deepest condolences to those who lost their loved ones and hope for the speedy recovery of the injured. In particular, we sincerely wish that the children who should be receiving treatment will get prompt and appropriate care. We are deeply frustrated that we must be once again updated on the numerous and increasing civilian casualties resulting from the clear violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has led to the death and injuries of countless innocents, continuing to worsen the humanitarian crisis on the ground. Since the beginning of Russia's aggression, so many children who should be the future of Ukraine and the future of the world have been mercilessly killed and maimed. According to the annual report on children and armed conflict in 2023 alone, the UN verified the killing of 80 children and maiming of over 330 children. It is also recorded that over 200 schools and 90 hospitals were attacked. It is unfathomable that these figures do not represent the whole scale of impact on children. We must never forget child abductions by Russia as well. They should be returned home and be united with their loved ones immediately. My delegation is absolutely enraged by Russia's continuous disregard for international law, including international humanitarian law. Attacks targeted against civilians and civilian objects are clearly prohibited by IHL. The international community will not tolerate impunity for those responsible and perpetrators of violations of IHL and all other heinous acts must be identified and held accountable. Once again, we reiterate our clear position to urge Russia to cease its aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Japan continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank Japan for their statement, and I will now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation.
I would begin by thanking France and Ecuador for convening this meeting. As is clear from the statements of Western colleagues, which are, by the way, very minimalist, the topic of the alleged Russian strike on the Children's Hospital, for the discussion of which they convened us today, clearly is not a very gratifying topic. And they probably saw many analyses of what happened on photos and videos, from which it clearly follows that this was a missile of the Ukrainian air defense. Here you get the magic of verbal gymnastics demonstrated today by Western members of the Security Council, trying by any means to protect the Kyiv regime. For us, this meeting is an excellent opportunity to tell the truth about what actually happened. However, the truth, as is well known, does not interest our Western colleagues, and in the best traditions of the Bucha provocation, or with the Mariupol hospital, which was mentioned today, they tried to engage in wishful thinking by condemning the allegedly intentional strike of the Russian Air Force against the children's medical facilities. Now, the dishonesty of this tactic is clear to the naked eye, as was noticed immediately by the Ukrainians themselves, thanks to the video of the strike against the hospital complex, which appeared in the internet, and negated all attempts by Kyiv and Western propagandists. Here are the references of the most full publication. These are QR codes. And here's what immediately after the event was published by Ukrainian Telegram channels, which remain the only uncensored source of information, uncensored by the Ukrainian authorities for their compatriots. And I quote, "The presidential office has instructed everyone to only publish and promote information related to the children's clinic Okhmatdyt in order to A, divert attention from other issues, as there are interesting sites nearby where people could question the government about why military facilities are located so close to residential areas and hospitals. B, attempt to boost the morale of the army and the people by fueling hatred toward the enemy. They claim that the enemy intentionally targeted children, although everyone knows that the rocket was accidentally shot down." This is a quote. C, distract the masses from the daily lawlessness of the government, corruption, tariff increases, price hikes, growing disillusionment, etc. D, divert attention from the constant retreat of the armed forces of Ukraine. E, create additional reason for justifying the conscription in the name of Zelensky. And E, create a media hype in the Western press before the NATO summit. End of quote. Here's another quote. Regarding the strike against the Okhmatdyt children, it's quite clear it was a air defense of NASAMS that went off course and hit the children's corpus. Western air defense also often miss their targets, and most often this happened when the air defense of the Ukraine hit Poland, hit a tractor. If the X-101 missile had hit the building, the damage would have been much worse. We all constantly write that Ukrainian air defense missiles often go off target. There was many such tragedies before, and the presidential office was constantly lying to people that these were Russians who intentionally struck residential buildings. The presidential office has to constantly fuel hatred among Ukrainians and justify the continuation of the war by these artificial tragedies. And the military themselves acknowledge such tragedies are as a result of air defense. This is a quote from Ukrainian sources, it's not mine. Colleagues, I hope now you can understand that no matter how the Kyiv regime and its Western sponsors tried to represent the tragedy as a result of an intentional Russian strike, even in the eyes of regular Ukrainians, the version does not hold water. In these conditions, we really regret that the Council has been drawn into this dirty propaganda campaign of Kyiv and its abettors. And I'd like to ask Mr. Zhovner a question. How he, when he went into the street, understood that the hospital was subject to a Russian strike? Who provided this kind of information, which clearly contradict common sense? Does he understand that if this had been a Russian strike, there would have been nothing left of the building, and all the children and most of the adults would have been killed and not wounded? But due to the fact that the screen has been darkened, I don't think we'll hear an answer from Mr. Zhovner. We have often stated that Russia does not strike civilian targets in Ukraine. And if speaking of strikes of the Russian Air Force, which were conducted against military targets in Ukraine and the air bases of Ukraine, one of these targets is the factory of Artem, one of the largest enterprises of the Ukrainian defense industry. This is one of the main producers of aviation missiles, weapons, and ammunition. And this target, according to data based on objective evaluation and based on testimony of people of Kyiv themselves, was hit. Since the factory is about 2 kilometers from the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, there's every opportunity to assume that the air defense missile was meant to intercept the Russian missile and which was meant to hit the factory. Now, such tragedies could be avoided if the Kyiv regime, in contravention of international humanitarian law, did not locate air defense and heavy weaponry in residential neighborhoods. However, its Western sponsors prefer to look away regarding that important fact. We also can't fail to mention the fact that the Ukrainians themselves in the social media noted an interesting trend. The tragedy with the hit of the air defense rocket into the hospital, children's hospital, occurred on the eve of the NATO summit. And this is the third NATO summit since the beginning of the special military operation. And similar situations occurred on the eve of each one of them. It was the same on the 27th of June of 2022 when Ukrainian media reported about an explosion in a mall in the city of Kremenchug in the Poltava Oblast, where supposedly hundreds of people were there. In actuality, the fire in the mall, which was empty and was not functioning, took place as a result of the detonation of ammunition which was held in a neighboring building and was provided by the U.S. and Europe. The same thing happened on the night of the 6th of July of 2023 when the Russian Air Force delivered a strike against a temporary deployment of Ukrainian soldiers and foreign mercenaries in Lvov. And noteworthy that the mayor of Lvov, Mr. Sadovy, acknowledged that the buildings, residential buildings, were damaged by fragments of the air defense. In all these situations, these were maximally exploited by the head of the Kyiv clique in order to beg for more weapons for Ukraine. It's an interesting tendency, isn't it? And it's quite noteworthy that Ukrainian media resources have also noticed this. And by the way, another question begs to be asked. And this is in relation to the words of the representative of Slovenia regarding the confirmed Russian strike against the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital. In videos posted by Ukrainian users, it's clear to see how one after another, without any interference, 5 rockets of the Russian Air Force strike the factory. Also, it's clearly seen that without any interference, a single rocket hits the children's hospital, a rocket of the air defense of Ukraine. It's impossible to mistake it due to the easily recognizable rocket fin assembly and other traits. How is it possible that the Ukrainian air defense misses all 5 strikes against the factory, but hits the children's hospital directly? Maybe the representative of the Kyiv regime can answer that question. We await also reaction from Norwegian authorities, who, it would seem, supplied to the assembly NASAMS to the Zelensky regime. Did they authorize it to be used for a strike against the children's hospital? And also that it, in contravention of international humanitarian law norms, that it would be located in residential neighborhoods. Against that background, in line with instructions on how to conduct propaganda, the head of the presidential office, Yermak, had time to make a statement about the impossibility of negotiations with Russia. There's no doubt that the leadership of Ukraine will use today's situation as a pretext for the further ignoring the demands and aspirations of Ukrainian society and of all international society for an attempt to find a peaceful solution to the crisis. And it's understandable, because in such a scenario there will be no need for an emergency military situation, and this will require holding elections. And the Kiev clique, which has lost all legitimacy, fears this more than anything, acknowledging that the population has a very negative attitude toward it. This is why it prefers to sacrifice tens, if not hundreds of thousands of its own citizens who were sent into a senseless meat grinder. We, on our side, have frequently spoke in favor of beginning negotiations and ending hostilities. However, this must be a cessation rather than a pause in hostilities, in order to give Kyiv, which would give the possibility for Kiev to lick its wounds and rearm. Furthermore, the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis must be tackled. Without this, there will not be any sustainable and lasting peace. Our conditions for concluding the conflict were clearly stated by President Putin on the 14th of June at the meeting with the leadership of our foreign ministry. We value also initiatives of all states who are aimed at a genuine ceasefire and taking into account our legitimate concerns, rather than aimed at promoting propaganda operations such as a pseudo-peace conference in Switzerland. And as long as Kyiv and its sponsors remain deaf to the appeals of using diplomacy, we will continue to be forced to compel Ukraine to peace and eliminate the root causes of the current crisis situation through military means. I will now go back to my role as President of the Council, and I give the floor to Ukraine.
Well, distinguished members of the Security Council, I would like to thank all of you who have given words of support and expressed your sympathy following yesterday's barbaric attack against Ukrainian civilians, including children. I would also like to thank Acting Under-Secretary General Msuya and Mr. Zhovnir for their comprehensive briefings, revealing the dreadful outcomes of the Russian missile strike. I'm sorry to recognize the representative of the terrorist Putin's regime in the chair's seat. It has become a tradition for Russia to mark its presidency in the Council with heinous war crimes and genocidal endeavors. This time is no exception, and the chair's seat is already soaked with blood. Yesterday, Russia deliberately targeted perhaps the most vulnerable and defenseless group in any society: children with cancer and other life-threatening illnesses. Even in times of peace, these children face enormous challenges and require specific support and care. It has always been recognized as one of the most touching manifestations of humanity and empathy to donate and help such children, to ensure they get medical treatment, and to create joyful moments to alleviate their sufferings. The Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital in Kyiv, the largest medical center treating young patients with cancer and other life-threatening illnesses, has served this goal and helped thousands of children from across Ukraine and abroad. The director of the Okhmatdyt has just briefed the Council on the unique position of this hospital in the system of medical treatment of children. Yesterday, Russia again showed its repugnant version of empathy toward children by attacking the Okhmatdyt with a Kh-101 cruise missile. That is slide 1. It's analysis of objective monitoring data on the flight trajectory of the cruise missile on July 8 from 9:40 a.m. to 10:40 a.m. The photo shows the trajectory of the missile from the moment it entered the airspace of Ukraine and the moment it struck the hospital building. The video footage clearly testifies that the Okhmatdyt hospital was a deliberate target. The footage captured the moment the Kh-101 missile dived towards the hospital building. Later, the Security Service of Ukraine made public the pictures of the remnants of this missile found on the spot. Slide 2. During the inspection of the scene, the investigators of the Security Service of Ukraine and the National Police found and examined fragments and parts of the air missile that struck the hospital. According to the preliminary assessment of military specialists, the specified objects belong to the parts and components of the Kh-101 strategic air-to-ground cruise missile, which is in service with the Russian Army and is used by Russian long-range aviation units. The photo on the right below shows the identified fragment of the casing of the Kh-101 cruise missile with part of the serial number displayed . Slide 3. Fragment of the Kh-101 missile under the rubble of the hospital building, part of the missile body. Slide 4. Characteristic elements of the Kh-101 missile have been identified and examined. The photo on the left shows a fragment of the wing opening mechanism of the Kh-101 cruise missile. The photo on the right shows a fragment of the Kh-101 cruise missile engine. As a result of the strike, the toxicology ward, where young patients received dialysis, was completely destroyed. Other facilities at the Okhmatdyt, including surgical, medical, diagnostic buildings, trauma, as well as hematology and oncology departments, were damaged. Additionally, the Russian missile damaged the nearby Center for Pediatric Cardiology and Cardiac Surgery, where 3 heart surgeries were underway at the moment of the strike. We have just heard the professional assessments of the long-term consequences for the treatment of hundreds of seriously ill children. These consequences include both physical harm and distress endured by the patients, as well as the destruction of the medical provision necessary to treat them. Alongside the immediate casualties among the medical personnel and children following the strike, these long-lasting outcomes also constitute a war crime. Even more abhorrent is the fact that the Okhmatdyt hospital was just one of many targets in Russia's heavy missile strike, which hit the cities of Kyiv, Kryvyi Rih, Dnipro, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Pokrovsk yesterday. According to information from the Defense Forces of Ukraine, the Russian Federation launched 38 missiles, including Kinzhal air ballistic missile, Iskander-M ballistic missile, Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, KH-101, KH-22, and Caliber cruise missiles, as well as KH-59-69 guided aerial missiles. Almost 100 civilian sites were savagely attacked. Medical and educational facilities, residential buildings, business centers. In Kryvyi Rih, 11 people were killed following the attack on the administrative building of a local industrial facility. In Kyiv, along with the Okhmatdyt hospital, the list of targets includes a maternity hospital where 9 people were killed and a residential building where the Russians killed 7 residents, including 4 children. Let us not forget that the pains Russia goes to harm Ukrainian children has been a mainstream aspect of the aggression from the very beginning. The children who Russia cannot abduct and brainwash, Russia kills. Let us not forget that Russia is kept on the list of shame for the crimes its armed forces have committed against children. Let us not forget that the person sitting today at the head of the table represents a wanted criminal suspected of crimes against children and subject to arrest under the ICC warrant. At least 47 people were killed and more than 190 were wounded following yesterday's strike. Putin's envoy employed his usual tactics of denying reality and blaming Ukrainian air defense. I recall clear footage of the Russian missile approaching the hospital, the scale of the destruction, and the eyewitness accounts. His comments about the possibility to destroy it entirely if Russia supposedly hit are just monstrous. Other Russian propagandists, particularly the so-called Z bloggers, have been more open. Z bloggers are administrators of Russian propaganda channels on social media with hundreds of thousands of followers. Given the specifics of their audiences, they, unlike their colleagues from the Russian diplomatic corps, openly explain the rationale behind the Kremlin's bloody actions. One of them, certain Roman Saponkov, openly stated that the strike on the children's hospital in Kyiv would benefit Russia, and I quote, "Such attacks might even be beneficial because an average Westerner might finally have a thought, damn, the same could have happened to us. And the children's center in Kyiv looks very much like a hospital in Warsaw. Incidents like these might work in our favor." End of quote. They do not even hide that they are deliberately attacking hospitals. That is exactly what Russians regularly did in Syria from 2015. In April 2016, for instance, they attacked the main health care facility for children in the city of Aleppo. killing 24 civilians. It is also telling that in 2020, Russia withdrew from a voluntary UN arrangement aimed at protecting hospitals and humanitarian aid deliveries in Syria. Now they aim to kill Ukrainian children and also to intimidate the countries which demand Russia comply with the UN Charter. The attack on a children's hospital is also an indication of Russia's current unwillingness to engage in a peace process. It is not surprising that Russia persists in rapidly tearing apart the concept of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter principles, a concept, I underline, that is at the core of both Ukraine's peace formula and the UNGA resolution ES 11/6 of February 23, 2023. Russia has rejected its responsibility to adhere to the UN Charter and, in fact, demands that the international community acknowledge its right to violate international law. However, the attack on the Children's Hospital is also a manifestation of Russia's deepest contempt for any peace initiatives, regardless of their origin. The Kremlin's moral and managerial degradation has reached such an extent that it does not hesitate to commit crimes that undermine the vision for peace of those countries on which Kremlin now entirely depends. Russia is like cancer, only worse. It will stop killing and expanding violence only when it is incapable of doing so. It is imperative to shoot down Russian missiles. It is imperative to destroy Russian combat aircraft at their bases. Bold steps must be taken to eliminate any security deficit. Currently, the UN membership is actively preparing for the Summit of the Future. We are engaged in active negotiations on the final document with the Declaration on Future Generations as its integral part. The question is, however, what kind of future are we talking about if the murderer feels comfortable sitting knee-deep in children's blood in the chair's seat here? As I said in this chamber in 2022, this war criminal will end up in hell, bypassing purgatory, and his place there is eternal. What matters, however, is how he will be put in the dock before that. I can't stomach the thought of how one can shake his hand and accept a lunch with him paid for with blood money. It is sickening to think of how, in about a week, his depraved boss, Lavrov, will preside over all of you in this chamber and lecture you on multilateralism. How many more Russian crimes will it take for the issue of the presence of the dictatorial Kremlin regime in the Soviet permanent seat to be addressed? What atrocities must be committed to ensure that the aggressor's veto is disregarded and the Security Council is able to respond to Russia's aggression and war crimes? The international community has the necessary capacities to provide the aggressor with proper answers. Answers in the only language that any aggressor understands: strong, resolute, and united actions to defend the Charter, to stop its violations, and to ensure accountability for all crimes, including those committed yesterday. I thank you.
In accordance with the traditions of the Council presidency, and purely as the President of the Council, I am compelled to thank Ukraine for their statement, and I now give the floor to the head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, and the EFTA countries Iceland, Liechtenstein, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. As we heard from USD Msuya and from Dr. Zovnik yesterday, several waves of large-scale Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities caused at least 40 civilian deaths, including children, and over 150 injuries. The numbers go up every hour. In Kyiv, the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital was directly hit by a missile, a children's hospital. The images of the aftermath of that attack are devastating. Panicked parents holding their children on the street, doctors and nurses scrambling to provide first aid against the backdrop of destruction. The attacks were immediately and roundly condemned by both Secretary General Guterres and PGA Francis and countless leaders and voices around the world. They are a stark reminder of why the Russian armed forces are listed by the UN as a perpetrator of great violations against children in armed conflict. By targeting Okhmatdyt, a symbol of Ukraine's childcare medicine, Russia once again demonstrates its cruelty and its utter insincerity about peace talks. One can only imagine the further horrors that were averted by the courageous interventions of Ukraine's air defenses. Colleagues, we are confronted with a striking paradox. The member state currently holding the presidency of the UN Security Council, the body responsible for maintaining peace and security, is intensifying, as we speak, attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including that country's hospitals and power plants. Such systemic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure violate international humanitarian law and must stop immediately and unconditionally. In a report issued last week, the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights extensively documented Russia's targeting of energy infrastructure, as well as its use of so-called double tap strikes, where it uses high-precision weapons to strike the same location twice within a short interval, causing additional casualties among civilians and first responders. These are the facts. These are the facts. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by their war. Later this week, the UN General Assembly will vote on a resolution regarding the threats posed to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and to support the work of the IAEA in ensuring nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. It is the first time in history, that a nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, has been illegally seized by a foreign aggressor. History matters here. History, including the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, has taught us all the existential importance of nuclear safety and security. Russia's irresponsible actions place all of us at risk. That is why we hope and expect that all UN member states will strongly support this resolution and this initiative for nuclear safety. In closing, I cannot but reaffirm, especially in the aftermath of this inhumane bombings, the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The European Union will continue to support both Ukraine and respect for the UN Charter, in response to Russia's illegal aggression for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank the EU for their statement, and I now give the floor to Poland.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, let me start by thanking today's briefers for their remarks and testimony. Just over 3 weeks ago in Bürgenstock, Switzerland, countries gathered to look for the path to just peace in Ukraine. The final document of the conference, signed up to today by 90 countries and international organizations, opens with the following sentence: the ongoing war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine continues to cause large-scale human suffering and destruction and to create risks and crises with global repercussions. Only 24 hours ago, the aggressor sent us the latest chilling reminder of how acutely precise these words are. Russia's unprovoked war continues with unprovoked, indiscriminate attacks against the innocent and the most vulnerable. Excellencies, since the launch of its full-scale military invasion in February 2022, Russian forces have targeted the largest Ukrainian nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, the largest Ukrainian water dam in Kakhovka, and now, brazenly enough, they took aim at the largest Ukrainian children's hospital in Kyiv, with hundreds of young patients seek relief and comfort. The attack was immediately condemned by numerous world leaders, including my country's highest authorities, which were hosting President Zelensky in Warsaw on this very day. It is very important that we also gathered in this chamber to once again deplore the Russia's atrocities, especially during the month it holds Security Council presidency, and to loudly redeclare that under international humanitarian law, hospitals have special protection. It is important for the world to hear the truth about Russia deliberately creating humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine, but is attacked and moreover using them as a tool of disinformation campaigns, as we heard also today. Poland duly notes that the 2023 Secretary General's report on children in armed conflicts for the second consecutive year correctly identifies Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups as parties that commit grave violations. In Ukraine, Russia not only commits such atrocities attacks as one of the children's hospitals in Kyiv, but it continues its disgraceful practice of forcible displacement of Ukrainian children. All this violates international law, including Geneva Convention, Genocide Convention, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it constitutes a war crime for which Russia must be held accountable. Children who remain in Ukraine face the risk of death and loss of health and have very limited opportunities for development and education. And let me be clear, saying so, we have in mind not only Ukraine, but the children in every conflict where children are targeted victims. Excellencies, according to media experts' estimates, Russia spent as much as $250 million on yesterday's missile barrage against targets in several Ukrainian cities. Instead of spending money on treating its own children, Russia prefers to spend hundreds of millions on killing children in Ukraine. And it's not only about Ukraine. The sum of money spent on this one-day attack would be sufficient for building several hospitals in developing countries. Russia's war cost everybody dearly, both in loss of lives and material damage. Distinguished delegates, can you imagine what would be those costs in the case of nuclear disaster? This is why the UN General Assembly will soon vote on the resolution condemning the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which urges Moscow to refrain from its nuclear gamble of illegally occupying Zaporizhia nuclear power plant that puts us all at the great risk. We truly hope that the proposal will garner the broadest possible support, which will underscore our commitment to restoring peace in Ukraine in accordance with the UN Charter and fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and will be in line with the declaration of the latest peace summit in Switzerland. Let's save the children from the scourge of war. Thank you.
I thank Poland for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.